So, what is slop exactly? Now, the term goy slop, or slop for short, as I'm going to refer to it throughout this video, it's a term that's been used a lot in online discourse lately, like right wing online discourse. And I think getting to the bottom of it, the term slop, it can really be used to describe a lot of the shit that pervades our culture lately. And I want to really define what it means. Now, from my perspective, what slop means is essentially anything that is meant to appeal to a lowest common denominator that is slapped together, that is not of particularly high quality, and especially, I repeat myself, it is meant to appeal to the masses. It is, like, for instance, just because something is bad doesn't necessarily mean that it is slop. But yes, just because something is slop does mean that it's either bad or mediocre. If it's slop, it can't be truly great. It might be enjoyable in a mediocre way or addictive, but it's not truly great. It's not of truly high quality. So what would be, so for instance, I mean, when looking at slop, like as I said, not everything bad is slop. So to define what is slop, I'll give one example of what is not. What is not slop is ugly modernist artwork. And the reason that's not slop is because that appeals to intellectuals and it appeals to pretentious upper class people. It's not really a lowest common denominator thing. It's more like the shit that the upper class eat up. I mean, I don't even think it could be called slop. It's more like eating shit but putting caviar on top of it. Whereas slop is more like something that is supposed to appeal to the lowest common denominator. So again, like not all forms of shit are slop. Something can be shit without being slop, but for it to be slop, it does have to be either shit or mediocre. So I hope I've explained that well. But for instance, what is slop? I would say, okay, the term slop can apply to a number of things. It could be literally in the case of food, which is really where the term goy slop originates from. Entertainment, obviously, like movies, TV, video games, books, music. It could apply to architecture. But I don't think that like pretentious modernist architecture, like say the Guggenheim Bilbao Museum, is the best example. I think, like, again, as I said, that's something more to appeal to like pretentious elites. I think if anything, slop architecture would be like suburban cookie cutter houses or like your generic strip malls. Like I think that would be more like slop architecture. Perhaps some of these like 5-over ones though, I think are slop though, because they're meant to be for like sort of like lower middle class renting urbanites. But yeah, slop, as I said, is not meant to appeal to the elite. It's meant to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And that's not to say that everything the elites like is good. There's a lot of shit that the elites like. It's just that I don't think the term slop is appropriate for it, because slop describes a very particular type of crap or mediocrity. So as I said, yeah, it can apply to all those things. It can apply to like online content. Like you can have slop content. Some of my content probably is slop, but I try to ensure that most of it isn't. But yes, like there's plenty of like clickbait, brain rot content online that is essentially slop. Now, slop, as I said, it can be shit or mediocre. Some slop is actually quite addictive, and in order to be addictive, it can't be total shit. It has to be kind of more like mediocre. Whereas absolute shit can also be slop, but it's not usually quite as addictive simply because its shittiness just makes it not palatable to most people. But nonetheless, a lot of people do like stuff that is absolute shit, so I don't know. But yeah, examples of slop, in each of the examples I've made, okay, like, I mean, brain rot online content, like, a lot of that would be like, say, your typical clickbait stuff, like videos that are lists and that don't really provide much actual information or substance on why each thing is in the list, like stuff that's just really clickbaity, or like you'll never believe what this the reason why Dave Mustaine won't talk to James Hetfield anymore. Something like that. Something that's just really, really kind of clickbaity, or that appeals to like people's desire for like drama, gossip, tabloid tier shit, or also just like a lot of AI slop. That's another thing. A lot of it is literally created by AI, or if it's not literally created by AI, it might as well be because it reads or watches like it is. So basically, stuff that doesn't have much of any importance to say, but is kind of addictive and kind of hooks you because it triggers the dopamine response in your brain. So that would be an example of slop in terms of online content. Like some of these listicles, like the 10 most underrated travel destinations in Europe, and then it's like you read it and it's like, oh, I already know about all 10 of these places. At least in my case, I would. Like that kind of thing is like slop online content, or any kind of celebrity gossip, or any kind of like really like shallow tier commentary on media, like analyzing something like, let's say, like, oh, here's why we think Aquila or Mari will be the next character to die in Yellow Jackets, as opposed to like analyzing Yellow Jackets from like a deeper, more thematic perspective. Like that would be an example of like slop content. And okay, like that's okay. So online content, that's one. Okay, food examples of slop food. This is the most obvious one. Would be like McDonald's or something like that. Just fast food, kind of like, yeah, mega chain fast food that basically appeals to a lowest common denominator. A lot of like, but it's not just working class people. Like people across the board tend to shove it down their throats. But it does have a certain that's why it's the lowest common denominator, because it appeals to people throughout different classes, but in a very base way. Hence, yeah, lowest common denominator. So basically, like, yeah, McDonald's, fucking Burger King, Taco Bell, like that sort of stuff. It just doesn't taste like real, Like it doesn't taste like real food. That's why, like, to be honest, I wouldn't call every chain necessarily slop. Like, in my opinion, for instance, Chipotle, despite being a mega chain, is a cut above in terms of how good the food actually tastes and how much it tastes like actual food and not just like really like synthetic, fake, literal or figurative slop. Like in some cases, it literally tastes like slop. Like some Taco Bell stuff, like just looks and tastes like literal slop. Um, but that's what I mean. Like it's. I wouldn't call all large chains necessarily slop, but there is definitely a strong correlation between being a large chain and being slop. Like I would say, at very least, like the very top chains are pretty much slop. Yeah. Ironically, at the very top chains, I'd actually say KFC is the least slop like, because it tastes like actual food more so. Like you can actually taste like actual chicken and it tastes like actual meat, and not like McDonald's, which doesn't even taste like real meat. I mean, I think it actually is pink sludge. I'm pretty sure that's not just like the worms thing is bullshit, but the pink sludge thing, to my knowledge, is actually true. So, like, I mean, that would be part of what slop is, just like that it doesn't taste like real food. Like the meat doesn't taste like meat. It doesn't really have that actual food, like that rich taste you would associate with like a real juicy meaty hamburger, for instance, or something like that. Like it just tastes very mass produced. But it's not only that, it's also just like, I think the atmosphere makes it slop, like in the sense that like fast food mega chains, they look, it looks the same everywhere. The interior of the buildings are just ugly, and the interior and exterior alike are ugly, and they look the same everywhere, and it's just very like assembly line mass produced, like the entire way that they put it together. And it's just the atmosphere is also what contributes to the sense of it being slop, not just the food itself. And the fact that it's just the same everywhere you go, hence lowest common denominator, like on a global scale, like this idea of just sameness. Like, I think that's another thing about slop is like, there's always a mass production element to it. There's always a sameness element to it. Which is why, like, even like, okay, like, there you could debate over this. Like, what is more slop? Let's say something that is a chain, a mega chain, but tastes more like actual food, like say Chipotle, versus like some of these really shitty street vendors that you have. Like some of these food trucks, again, food trucks and vendors can vary wildly in quality, but if you have one that's like really shit tier, but at least it feels like local, it's not part of a mega chain, like is that more slop, or is something like Chipotle more slop? I mean, it's debatable, like the food versus the the sameness, the mass production. Like I don't know which is more slop between the two, but the thing that is the most slop is things that combine both of those traits. The slop like food combined with the sense of mass production, sameness, globalization, and uniformity. So all these things combined. Like I think that is what really creates the element of slop. And same with, as I mentioned, online content. One thing that makes it slop is not only the quality of it, but just the sameness of it. How you get bombarded by the same type of shit constantly based on whatever the algorithm feeds you. And it tends to feed you slop that corresponds to whatever your interests are. It's like, yeah, the algorithm knows me pretty well because it feeds me a lot of like travel slop articles related to my favorite TV series or movie series or whatever. Slop related to metal bands. Like it knows what I like. Let me put it that way. But it's still ultimately slop. It doesn't mean the stuff I like is slop. Like the places I travel to, the architecture, the nature, or the metal bands I listen to, doesn't mean those things are slop, but it means the kind of content related to those things that the internet feeds me is definitely slop, that the algorithm feeds me. Yeah, similarly, getting into it, so I kind of covered architecture already. What is slop architecture? Like a lot of this suburban cookie cutter crap. And a lot of the just mass produced modernist crap in general. Like mass produced townhouses or condos, just the really kind of generic ones. Like I think that's kind of the slop element, like the lowest common denominator aspect. But again, I don't think all ugly architecture is necessarily slop per se. Like I don't think like the Bilbao Guggenheim or the Graz Art Museum in Austria are slop, because they're more, rather than being like lowest common denominator, mass produced, slapped together, phoned in like kind of mediocre crap or just shitty crap, which is what slop is. These are more like really expensive things that are meant to appeal to pretentious intellectuals or pseudo intellectuals who are often like upper class. And it's not really for the masses. And in fact, the masses often, to their credit, reject stuff like that. Like a lot of the masses don't like that kind of garish modernist architecture or modern art, but they do like suburbia. They do like their strip malls and their cookie cutter houses. So again, like there is an element, like slop inherently does involve some degree of mass appeal. That's a huge trait. Like, again, I'm not saying that everything shitty is slop. And I'm not saying that everything slop is total shit. Some of it's just mediocre. Some of it's absolute shit. But I don't think anything that's slop, if something is truly of good quality, I think that it becomes elevated from being slop. Like even if it's something that is born out of a slop subculture, like for instance, like I would say, for instance, okay, The Matrix would be a good example. A lot of action movies are disposable slop, but just because The Matrix is an action movie doesn't mean it is. In fact, it's a very good movie. So like I do think that like when something is good enough, it's not slop anymore. There is definitely that component. Like quality is a component to it. but I'm just saying it's not the only component. There are things that are shitty but that are not slop. And I do have to emphasize this because I think some people get a bit confused there. Like they misuse the word slop to like goy slop or slop to mean anything that's just crap. And I don't think that's what the word is really supposed to mean. Like again, like I could be redefining it according to my own personal definition. But I don't know. From the context, I've seen the term used, and I think the proper use, honestly, is supposed to mean lowest common denominator mass produced junk. Like basically like junk food. Like the term junk food, like figurative or literal, is synonymous with slop or goy slop. And that's another thing. In addition to like fast food restaurants, there's also like the kind of food you would get at the grocery store or convenience store, like junk food. That would be another example of mass-produced slop, or like Coca-Cola or something like that, like mass-produced soft drinks and stuff like that. And also another component, at least with food, is unhealthiness. That's definitely implied by the word slop. Um, so yeah, that's another thing. And I would say unhealthy, whether for the body or the mind, in the sense that it's not doing anything for you. It's not really going to give you fulfillment. It might give you temporary happiness or a dopamine rush, but it's not going to fulfill you in any meaningful way. So again, let's go through art. Like, okay, like I think with like various forms of art and media, like with video games, a slop video game would be just something that's like dumb fun, but not particularly innovative or interesting or anything like that. Like I would say probably some of the Call of Duty games might be an example of that, sports games, whatever. Um, Whereas, like again, I don't want to make it that like, oh, slop is everything I dislike and not slop is everything I like. Because as I said with the aforementioned example, I keep repeating, like the Bilbao Guggenheim, despite the fact that I think it's a shitty, hideous building, it doesn't meet the definition of slop because it's not something with mass appeal. It's not something lowest common denominator. So yeah, with video games, those I guess would be examples like stuff like the Call of Duty games, or how they're just so fucking repetitive and there's so many of them, like stuff like that. Um, to be honest, I don't play as many video games as I used to, so I wouldn't be the best person to ask about video games in general, at least more current video games. But like thinking back to games of the era when I did play them more, like I think those games you know, would be somewhat indicative of like somewhat would somewhat exemplify slop. I don't know. With movies, best example is the MCU. MCU movies are just pure slop. I mean, yeah, occasionally you'll get one that elevates itself above the pack, but I would say at least 90% of the MCU movies are just straight up slop. Like basically phoned in, mass produced, by the numbers, connect the dots. Like everything's very formulaic. It's created by a committee. There's not much creative freedom. It has to follow a specific formula and adhere to it very strictly. And it's designed to appeal to the masses as much as possible. Like, yeah, occasionally you'll get like I'd say honestly, there's maybe like only one or two movies in the MCU or three maybe that aren't total slop. Like I would say, I would actually say, to be honest, the first event, no, not the first, the Infinity War. That would be probably the one movie I would say elevates itself most from being slop. But even that movie has many slop components to it. But I think the one thing that elevates it from being total slop is the fact that Thanos actually has some interesting things to say, which is more than I can say for like any of the other fucking MCU movies. And again, there's varying degrees. Like I'm not saying they're all shit. Some of the MCU movies aren't shit. Some are shit, and some are more like mediocre. Some might even be like, okay, that was fun. You know, it was worth the $10 or $15 or whatever it is now. Like Paul Walker said about brick mansions. Like basically, that's some of them are okay. Some of them might even be like a 7 out of 10, but none of them like fundamentally are going to make you feel like, wow, that was an amazing cinematic experience. That was, You know what I mean? Like even at their best, they don't make you feel that way. So even at their best, they might be like high quality slop, but they're still kind of mediocre and forgettable, and still kind of mass produced and not particularly interesting or innovative or just creative, or nor do they have anything really groundbreaking to say, nor will they really make a fundamental impact on your life. They're just kind of like, oh, that was fun. At best, you'll be like, ah, that was a fun movie. And then you'll forget about it 2 hours later. That at best, you know? And as I said, like, I think Avengers Infinity War of the entire series is the one movie that elevates itself most above that, because it actually does have something to say. Although, to be fair, it's not the first movie to say those things. But I'll give it credit, it said it better than almost any other. Like, frankly, Thanos, he had a point about some stuff. I'll say that. Um, but yeah, going on. So movies like that would be an example. Um, Again, I'm not saying that every movie that tries to be fun is slop. Like I gave the aforementioned example of the Matrix films. Like the Matrix trilogy is not slop. Like it has the action scenes are genuinely innovative, like in terms of the visuals, the choreography, the special effects, and they're very creative. B, the movies are full of philosophy and themes and metaphors. And C, they're very interesting in terms of their world building. So, like, no, the Matrix films are not slop. Like, Lord of the Rings is not slop. Like, just because something you can enjoy it and have fun, like, Back to the Future is not slop. Okay, just because something is fun does not make it slop. What makes something slop is that it feels phoned in, mass marketed, not particularly creative or interesting, doesn't have anything in particular to say that's especially groundbreaking or profound. That's basically what slop is. And again, yeah, there's some amount of personal opinion in there. I'm not denying it, but at the same time, it's kind of like porn. You know it when you see it. Like, let's not pretend that people don't recognize this. Even if before the term goy slop or slop was going around, people, they kind of knew it when they saw it. They kind of, on an intuitive level, if you're a more intelligent, discerning person, you probably realize it on some level. Like, this movie feels phoned in. It feels like a product. It feels like it was made by a committee, something like that. So those would be examples. TV, like, again, a lot of this MCU stuff, Star Wars stuff, like, just Andor is not slop. Andor is actually a good show, but just a lot of really phoned in stuff, and a lot of stuff on Netflix is slop too. Like frankly, the show You started out pretty good, but it's becoming increasingly slop over time. It's just become so fucking repetitive. Like, good gosh. And that's the thing with shows and movie series. Just because one installment is slop doesn't mean all will be, and vice versa. Something can start out as something more genuinely authentic and become slop, or vice versa. It is entirely possible. Like, look at Star Wars. Like, it goes back and forth between being slop and not slop, like, more than any other fucking franchise I've ever seen, maybe. And with books, an example would be like these throwaway romance novels, or like these really generic young adult novels. Even with nonfiction, there's slop, like stuff that's just has a point that could be expressed in an article, but feels the need to just steamroll it into like a 300-page book. Like a lot of just like pop psychology stuff that isn't particularly profound or insightful. Like that, there's a lot of book slop out there. But yeah, music. Okay, again, like, I mean, most pop music is slop. Hip hop in general, like, I'm not gonna say country in general. I'm not gonna say like any genre is 100% slop, but there are genres that are like almost entirely slop, and like hip hop and country would be pretty bad for that. And pop, I would say the vast majority, although not all. Like, I would say pop actually probably has more exceptions than hip hop and country, but yeah, the vast majority is slop. And you know what? I will admit, like, as a metal fan, there are some types of metal that are kind of slop. Like, well, new metal in particular, there's some of this new metal stuff is definitely slop. Like some of these forgettable kind of new metal bands like Stained or whatever, or 3 Days Grace or what have you. Like a lot of that stuff is pretty much slop. Um and some of the old like glam hair metal, like some of that is slop, some's not. Like it's like again, lowest common denominator, uncreative, mass produced. Like, but at the same time, like for instance, something like Cannibal Corpse. I don't like Cannibal Corpse, but I would never call it slop simply because it has no mass appeal. Like it's something that appeals to a very, very niche demographic. And yeah, I don't think it doesn't meet the definition of slop in the same way that like the Bilbao Guggenheim does not meet the definition of slop, even though in my opinion both those things are pretty shitty. I mean, yeah, okay, Cannibal Corpse, they have some good riffs, but like I can't get past the vocals, and I just don't like the disgusting lyrics and all the disgusting shit they associate with themselves. This whole like edgy for the sake of edgy, disgusting crap. But yeah, my point is just because something shit doesn't make it slop. But yes, there are like even in my favorite like metal broadly speaking is my favorite genre, but yes, there is like Five Finger Death Punch or whatever. Like there is metal slop. It doesn't have quite as much mass appeal as like pop slop, hip hop slop, or country slop. Like as it's like country slop is for ruralites, pop slop is for suburbanites, and hip hop slop is for urbanites, basically. Although obviously there's a lot of overlap there in who listens to what. But yeah, I hope I've done a decent job at like explaining what slop is and giving some examples of it. Because it's a term that I use a lot and that I've seen a lot of people use a lot, and I just want to clear it up because I feel like there might be some misconceptions. So, yeah, that's all for now.